is Hodgson with the Pan-American Post, and I'm broadcasting from Armenia, Colombia. It is my pleasure today to be speaking with Gabriela Calderon. She is a columnist with El Universo and the editor of elcato.org. So she is well suited to discuss the topic today, which is basically the state of free speech in Ecuador, particularly a more recent law which came into force about 1 month ago. You might call it a state watchdog law, and also a redistribution law regarding to media. So I'm going to post these articles on the Facebook page of the Pan-American Post, which is just facebook.com/PanAm Post. But basically this has been covered widely, and I'll just give a little bit of background, which says Rafael Correa believes this is a step towards more balanced media and accuracy in the press, describing it as a watchdog agency to regulate, and also like I said, a redistribution mechanism to put more of the media in the hands of indigenous people and state media, so only 1/3 of all media is left in private hands. But I don't want to comment too much further on the actual bill and its manifestations, which Gabriela has written about. Do you want to clarify any points I made there and what this law actually means?
I think that's a good summary, actually. There's also the law is very broad, and it's very punitive. I spoke with a lawyer yesterday that says that there are around 58 threats of penal sanctions for certain types of expression in this law. And this is besides protections against defamation in the penal and civil code in Ecuador. So it's not like, because sometimes, a lot of people here say that this law came about because it was necessary to have some type of protection against the excesses of the press, and they're particularly referring to defamation and libel. But there's already a protection for that in the penal and civil codes. And the funny thing is that the provisions on those codes are more punitive if the libel or defamation is of a public authority. And so this has been used over the past 5 or 6 years to silence several journalists. And so what happens with this law is that it comes after about 5 years of having a chilling effect on the press because of those lawsuits based on that provision of the penal code.
As you note, it's not as though there hasn't been any prosecution against journalists prior to this law.
Right.
Why was there even a need for this new law if that is the case? I mean, there's already plenty of intimidation. I'm going to ask you more about what happened to El Universo, because they are a prominent publication which faced intimidation. So what did this new law bring to the table? What difference has it made?
Well, the previous it was called the telecommunications law, and it did not apply to written media. It only applied to radio and television.
Okay.
And so the president has had a very personal battle with El Universo, which was a written media outlet. And so he wasn't able to have that much control over written media as he could over radio and TV. And so this law aids whatever attempt there might be to control written media, which was and still is a lot more free than radio and TV media outlets. This is because, like in most countries, TV and media outlets depend on a radio frequency issued by the state.
Yes, a license, yes.
A license. So the thing is that it's very much easier to control the radio and TV than it is written media. But this law, that's what's really new about this law, that it includes written media. It also might include new media, because there was a big debate around this law whether or not it was going to include new media like Facebook or Twitter, and they promised they were not going to include it, but the language of the law is so ambiguous that it might.
Right.
I mean, it depends on how you interpret it, and it depends on the bylaws that will be published within the next 2 or 3 months to implement this law.
Okay, and so one of the key, you could say, incidents of late, which you've also written about, is the closing of what at least the New York Times has described as the only weekly magazine in Ecuador, the Vanguardia, if I'm correct. And
Yes, Vanguardia.
so, and this was just in the last week or two. Now, many people have claimed that this was in part due to this new law and intimidation preceding this new law. How aggressive was this magazine, and did it really merit any confrontation at all?
Well, in December 2011, for the first time, Vanguardia suffered the confiscation of their computers. Apparently, this was justified, according to the government, because of violations of tax obligations. But it was very strange because there was like some type of SWAT team was sent to the offices of the magazine, and these guys that were armed, just like you would see in movies, a SWAT team.
Sure.
They came in surprisingly and took all the materials. So the magazine was not able to publish that issue because they took all the files. And this happened one more time sometime in 2012. I forget what point exactly, but it happened twice. And there was no due process because, when there's a suspicion of violation of, be it tax obligations or labor obligations, there's
Sure.
always a due process that needs to be followed. You can't just like break into an office and do these types of things. But they did it anyways, and it's not the first time. They've done it with other enterprises, not only media enterprises. And so this happened to Vanguardia, and Vanguardia was having economic difficulties. The president says it was because they were not selling enough issues. And that might be, it's not sensationalist press. It's not one of the best selling type of media because it is investigative reporting, which is expensive to do and which is not the one that would get you the most ratings.
Sure, sure.
And it is very risky for a businessman, be it a media businessman or an advertiser, to advertise in a magazine that publishes such controversial research.
Right.
And so basically the magazine might have had problems either because they were selling less numbers or because they were having less advertisers. It is easy to see why they would have less advertisers.
But of course, there was definitely intimidation going on, which helped push them over the cliff, you could say.
Yes, and also then you have the new law, right? And so when you have these new laws, the threats are not they're no longer imaginary. They're there. They're real, and this is a law that's already in force. All that we need now is they're waiting for 2 delegates to the new Council of Media Regulation, and then they can start applying the sanctions contemplated in this law. So what happens now is that whoever writes in media or whoever owns in media right now is in a very difficult position because what used to be sort of uncertain now is much more certain that there will be a very easy way to penalize expression.
Right. And how did this play out with El Universo? Because they were subject to a $42 million fine. This is just 2 years ago, I think, or not so long ago. And yet, in the end, the president backed down, I think because it was an embarrassment to him that a bunch of reporters were going to go to jail and be fined millions of dollars just for expressing a different opinion. Was there actually any credibility to that case? Do you know, just give people a little bit of context for what they actually were guilty of?
Okay, there's a novel legal concept here, and it's included in this law. Didn't used to be so formalized, but the president's lawyers they argumented that the journalist, well, he's not exactly a journalist. He used to write an opinion column for El Universo, and he was the editor of the opinion page. This
Sure.
was Mr. Emilio Palacio, and they claim that El Universo, by publishing Mr. Palacios' op-ed, his controversial op-ed based on the incidents of the 30th of September of 2010, that the owners of El Universo were aiding and abetting. and so that they should be co-responsible for whatever he said.
Yeah, people should know, given that context of what happened in 2010, I imagine you're referring to the confrontation between the military and police in Ecuador and Quito
Yes.
specifically? Right.
Yes, and Mr. Palacio said at the end of the op-ed that someday one president might sue Mr. Correa for having ordered fire against ordered the military to open fire against the hospital with patients.
Right.
And this was something he said. It was kind of a long sentence structured in a way that was hypothetical, like someday this might happen. But the president's lawyers and the president himself took upon this statement as an accusation that he did in fact order the military to open fire against a hospital with innocent patients. However, to this day, we don't know who ordered the military to open fire, and the events of that day have not been clarified. There was a member of the military that used to serve as director of that hospital, and he went on CNN a week after those incidents to say that the president was never hijacked, that he didn't know about this hijacking, and he contradicted the official version that was being crafted of the incidents that day, and that guy spent 6 months in jail without trial and without having done anything other than contradicting the official version. Also, that day on September 10 of 2010, all media was shut down. There was with no fixed term end of freedom of expression that day. They basically cut off the signals of channels and all radios, and all you could see was official television and official media.
Right, and you personally have written a more recent column in response to this law and the Vanguardia situation, and it's titled "Políticos Servidores or Redentores." I'm not sure whether I got the pronunciation right. It basically just means servants or saviors, and
right. Because the argument of the government and a lot of, you might be surprised, but a lot of artists and journalists here in Ecuador celebrate this new law. And normally, journalists and artists would be against such a regulation of speech because, this tends to hamper creativity. But they're not, and it would be interesting to point out why not. And for starters, artists have a kind of mercantilist candy in this law, because there's a provision in this law that requires that every radio has to have at least 60% of national music. It has to be produced by Ecuadorians.
Sure.
And 80% of publicity pieces, like advertising, has to be made by Ecuadorians. And also 50% of the programming on TV has to be made and produced in Ecuador.
Yeah, so there's very much a special interest component here. And
yes.
And I also mentioned at the beginning that only 1/3 of media now is allowed to be fully private. 1/3 has to be indigenous. I'm not sure how one defines that in the Ecuadorian context, because there are many different indigenous groups, but presumably they too have been supporters of these new laws because of their preferential treatment.
Yes, a lot of these indigenous media end up being financed almost entirely by the state. It's very unappealing for big companies and most potential advertisers to give funds to these media, these small media outlets, especially because they have a very local outreach. And a lot of the times they're not, they don't even reach their target audience, which are
right.
And so they end up having, depending almost entirely on the state advertising.
Right.
And, this can be easily politicized, and it is, as it has been shown that, the government no longer contracts with El Comercio and El Universo for advertising.
Sure. And so have you personally faced any threats against you or felt pressured in your own work?
I mean, not really. There's always a subtleness to it. This is not. It's a much more sophisticated and subtle government compared to Mr. Chavez's way of tackling the media, and however, it's not because of that it's less effective. In my case, what has happened is on a couple of times ministers have responded to certain articles, and most of the times their strategy is to try to kill your credibility. They try to argue that you have lied or distorted the truth in some way. But if you are careful and you have your facts and you have your sources, you can always respond and clarify that you have in fact not lied or misconstrued the facts. And what happened most recently was the editor of the state newspaper El Telégrafo. He dedicated the newspaper's op-ed to me. It was titled "The Ignorance of Gabriela Calderon." This is sort of like a badge of honor in these times.
Sure.
I didn't even mention Mr. Perez, but his problem was that I was writing an op-ed about public investment and about not every investment is the same, and I just mentioned that some public investments are actually expenditures. And I mentioned that El Telégrafo has had accumulated losses of around $20 million, despite the fact that they have the most modern printing press in the country. But no one will read or buy the newspaper, and it's so embarrassing that they just stopped publishing their finances and their account balances about 2 years ago. So no one knows what happens at that paper and how much public money they're wasting. And that's all I said. But he said that I was being ignorant because I couldn't appreciate the intangible value of a public media. And it's not all about profits according to them. But then again, because it's not all about profits, we can't even know what's going on in that newspaper. There's no transparency. We don't know what has been going on since the past 2 years. They don't publish any numbers. And so this is normal. This happens to most people that write opinion columns or that have radio shows, but they tend to focus on the people that conduct the shows on TV, and the president will do national broadcasts to attack a single person that has a TV show and or a magazine or a journalist that published an investigative journalism piece. So this happens all the time, and ironically, this type of attack on an individual by all the 20 media outlets that the state owns happens, and then they come out with this law and they make it illegal for any private media. Actually, it says for any media, but it doesn't look like they're going to apply it to themselves, to publish anything that might be understood as something that might undermine the credibility of someone. So when you publish investigative journalist pieces, what you do is you publish them little by little. It's kind of like you publish them drip by drip, and on Monday you might publish the first part, and then on Wednesday you might publish the second, and Friday the third. This is what Diario Expreso did when they were breaking the story on the president's brother's contracts with the state. That was a big story, and the president sued the authors of the book that later came about on that case. And so when Expreso did this, it was the talk of town. It was on the news everywhere. And what they did is they published it little by little, piece by piece, as long as the journals were doing their work. And with this law, that's not allowed because it would be considered media lynching.
Right, well, at this point, I'm going to have to finish it there, Gabriela, but I'll just say you can follow her on Twitter at Gabi Calderon, and I'm going to look to get an English translation of her article to explain what the situation is, and I really appreciate the work you're doing, so thank you for being on the Pan American Post.
Thank you very much.
Oh, it's our pleasure.